What is up, guys? It's the Sound Alchemist, part of OneMindSyndicate, and today I'm back to talk about Warhammer 40k. In this one, I will be reading a couple short stories about random events in the Warhammer 40k universe. This can range from Sisters of Battle to Nurgle Space Marines, all the way to the Orcs. And the reason why I just wanted to give you some of these events in the 40k universe is because I know you guys say that you listen to us when you're going to bed, or when you're painting, or when you're going to work and you've got a long trip ahead of you. So this is just something to kind of put in the background and enjoy. So without further ado, let's dive in. The candles flickered as the sanctum door was quietly opened. The Adeptus Sororita novice paddled softly across the marble floor. She waited patiently to a kneeling, silent Sister Superior. "Yes, my child?" asked the sister, without looking up from her devotion. "The mob approaches," whispered the novice, her voice betraying her unease. "It will be at the gate soon." Sister Candida was remaining kneeling as she concluded her prayers. "Give us strength, Divine Lord. May your will be done." She stood, turning from the effigy of the Emperor to face the young novice. "Fear not, my child. The Emperor is with us, and we shall prevail." The stout wooden doors of the cathedral were thrown open as the Battle Sisters marched onto its steps, chanting hymns to the Emperor and raising their ritually blessed weapons of faith. Bolter shells rained down, and arcane weaponry spouted cleansing fire. High above, the angelic forms of the seraphim dropped from the dark, towering spires, bolt pistols spitting death. Sister Superior Candida stood at the top of the marble steps, her bolter kicking in her arms as she pumped shell after shell into the heretics. The light from inside the cathedral framed her in a glowing halo of brilliance. Death to the defilers. Brother Sergeant Egil of the Space Wolves ducked behind the smoking burnt shell of a Land Raider, and he slammed a fresh magazine into his bolter. The remains of his blood claw pack were spread throughout the blasted ruin, gore-streaked and exhausted. Even with the filtering effects of his armor's auto-senses, the noise of battle was still deafening. He risked a glance around the side of the Land Raider. Thick clouds of choking black ash fell from a lacerated sky, and the entire city was aflame. Massive explosions and the thunder of artillery obscured the battle and rendered even his acute senses useless. Egil spun around, raising his bolter to a firing position as he heard the crunch of heavy footsteps approaching. The massive Terminator armored form of Brother Carlson of the Wolf Guard entered the building, and Egil lowered his gun. "Ready your men, Sergeant. We take the fight to the traitors," snarled the Wolf Guard. Even over the Voxcom's distortion and the din of battle, the edge of feral anticipation in Carlson's voice was unmistakable. Egil nodded, passing the word to his men. The green runes on his visor displayed blinked as the Space Wolves acknowledged his orders. Egil racked the side on his bolter as the ground suddenly shook under a thunderous impact. The deep rumbling crash sounded again, like an angry god's footstep, and Egil looked up as a massive shadow swallowed them. Emerging from the smoke like a vast beast from a saga, a night-gaunt titan towered above them, its dark carapace silhouetted against the bloody sky. Lights flared around the titan's head as Imperial fire impacted on its void shields, but the enormous machine ignored them, lifting one huge leg ponderously from the ground. Egil could easily hear the sound of the actuators over the explosions. This gigantic war machine's foot smashed aside buildings in its path, and Egil realized with sick horror exactly where it would next step down on. "Everybody up! Move!" he yelled as he fired his jump pack as the shadow of the Titan's foot descended upon them. Egil powered through the air, heedless of the crack of small arms fire that burst around him. He landed badly and cursed as he fell in the rubble, looking back to see Carlson slowly lumbering through the ruins. He screamed his name as the mass of the Titan's foot smashed through the building and crashed down upon the Wolf Guard Terminator. Egil covered his head as the Titan's other foot swept above him, showering dust and debris. Howling with rage, he fired his bolter ineffectually at the Titan as it strode onwards. unheeding of the great warrior it had just killed. Egil again reloaded his weapon, his thoughts filled with avenging the fallen Carlson. He looked over towards the flattened building and watched with astonishment as the rubble began to shift and heave. Massive chunks of plascrete and steel were pushed aside as Carlson pulled himself free of the debris. His Terminator armor had been gashed open in a dozen different places, and his blood was splashed crimson against its gray. But he was alive. The Wolfguard Terminator joined Egil in the ruins of the bunker and shouted, "Like I said, Sergeant, ready your men. We've wasted enough time already. We have a battle to win." The canyons of the ruined city trapped the smoke, dust, and noise of battle, turning each rubble-choked street into a hell of half-glimpsed shadows and phantoms. Trooper Corkin nervously licked his lips, glancing up at the shattered street along the gun sight of his last cannon. There were reports of Eldar movements in this sector, and he didn't want to suffer the same fate as 1st Platoon. They'd been found cut to shreds with the safeties still on their guns. He and Fredericks were positioned 100 meters away in front of their platoon, an early warning in case the decadent aliens would come their way. This thought didn't comfort him much. The sleek prow of an Eldar vehicle emerged seconds later, and Corkin squeezed the trigger on the last cannon, watching the powerful beam as though it traveled through the water before it struck the fast-moving vehicle. Corkin's jaw fell open as the blast scored the vehicle's side, but did no further damage. A warm electric sensation enveloped him as the Wave Serpent's energy field washed over him, and he never saw the blow from the striking Scorpion's chainsword that ended his life. Sister Alicia sang lustily along the devotional hymns reverberating from the loudspeakers attached to the hull of the immolator tank as it neared the mob of men in the marble-flagged square. Thinking they had the holy shrine surrounded, the rebel planetary defense troopers swarmed around the shrine of Our Lady of Perpetual Martyr. The seraphim descended from the armored buttresses of the vast cathedral, bolt pistols chattering a litany of death as the explosive bolts impacted deep into unarmored flesh. One of these rebel troopers recognized the armament of the immolator as it rumbled steadily towards enemy lines. Shorn of the long-range firepower of the Adeptus Astartes tanks, the flamethrower tank required proximity to fulfill its role as the purifier of the heretics. Autogun fire ricocheted from the front of the tank, and Alicia heard a clank as the top hatch of the immolator was thrown open. Sister Barita swung her heavy bolter out of the passenger compartment, sending a continual stream of large-caliber explosive bolts into the heretics. They were close to surrounding her now. At Alicia's signal, the sister ducked back inside and closed the top hatch. Alicia thumbed her button that fired up the ignition's flame of the Inferno cannon and flexed her gauntleted fingers on the trigger. The holy fire of her weapon, blessed by this very morning by the canoness, would soon show these blasphemous fools the errors of their ways. Corpses bloated with noxious gases spewed excremental fluids as the filth-encrusted Land Raider crashed them beneath its rusted iron tracks, grinding their jellied bones to pulp. Explosions burst around the massive vehicle, filling the air with lethal fragments and scouring the necrotic surface of its armored hide. Hulking and deformed warriors kept pace with the plague tank, firing mucus-covered bolters through the yellow fog as they advanced. The Imperial Fist defensive line was less than 50 meters away, the ground before it littered with the twisted, plague-ridden carcasses of those unfortunate enough to have been touched by the dark powers. The fog coiled around the Land Raider like a living thing, as though it moved on some vile business of its own. The white heat of last cannon fire speared through the sickly haze and struck the hull of the tank, blasting a deep wound on its fleshly exterior. The massive vehicle slowed around, but still kept moving, spinning tracks churning up scraps of rotten flesh and decaying limbs as it rumbled over the pathetic barricade. The ground shook as the vehicle crashed back to earth. The front ramp dropped, and pestilential fumes gusted from within. Vomited from the belly of the armored beast, warriors spawned in a festering nightmare that charged from the Land Raider, a foul miasma of contagion wreathing their helmets in smoky darkness. Almost 3 meters tall, the huge figures wore poisonous green suits of Terminator armor, splashed with clusters of weeping boils and sores. Diseased lesions and foul organic matter oozed from cracks of the armor, the stench of these plagued Terminators causing even the defending Space Marines to gag through their rebreather apparatuses. Captain Learchus of the Imperial Fists leveled his bolter at the hideous giants before him. Their souls were forfeit to the dark gods, and their inner corruption was manifest in their hideousness. Hatred like nothing he had known before coursed through his veins like the electric charge as he emptied a magazine into the traitors. His squad followed, firing without pause into the charging Terminators. Several shells found homes in the traitor flesh, blasting chunks of diseased tissue and ceramite clear. But not a single Terminator fell. The decaying armor and unnatural resilience of the followers of Nurgle carried them through the hail of fire. Brother Colathrax stalked leisurely through the fog of sweet corruption and hail of bolter shells, his plague sword licking out left and right. He cut, stabbed, and sliced skin and pricked organs, but he never killed outright. No, never that, for how can he deprive his enemies of the agonizing bliss of Father Nurgle's rods? How sweet it was to watch those whom the false emperor had made mighty descend into madness and decay, their once powerful bodies turning on them as plague reduced them to mindless, gibbering horrors. They had set themselves up as gods, but they would now pay the price for that arrogance. A Space Marine captain in blazing yellow armor stood before him, his sword raised and challenged, and he accepted. "Time to die, traitor," he said, and Colathrax chuckled. "I think not." He swung his dripping sword at his opponent, but he ducked, and he thrusted with his own weapon. The energized edge scraped a furrow into the Terminator's armor, but it slid clear. He battered aside his opponent's blade. The blade of the plague sword skewered the Space Marine in an upward arc, lifting him from his feet and hammering through the building behind. Learchus hung suspended above the ground, blood pooling beneath his twitching body. The wound refused to close, and he coughed bloody phlegm as he felt the meat of his body rotting from the inside out. He could feel his internal organs flooding with dead fluids, and the flesh of his limbs sloughing from the bones. His breath rasped as his lungs dissolved and his vision faded, his eyeballs liquefying, sliding down his face like gelatinous tears. He tried to curse his killer, but his throat had ruptured, and seconds later, his brain was a foetid gray ooze dribbling from his sagging head. The Nurgle Marine inhaled the intoxicating miasma of his master's putrescence, and he offered a short prayer to Father Nurgle.